The Transcendental Universe by C.G. Harrison, Lecture 5. My task this evening is a difficult one. The truths which I shall endeavour to convey are fragments of knowledge pertaining to some of the very highest mysteries, the full comprehension of which requires the development of faculties wholly latent in the majority of human beings, and but very feebly developed in the West, even among initiates. It will be my duty to explain, to the best of my ability, certain facts in connection with a mystery known as the mystery of the eighth sphere, which is a key to the problem of evil in the universe. It is sevenfold, and each of its minor mysteries is correlated to the sevenfold mystery of life on their 7 planes of consciousness. Now, I am well aware that there are many occultists who say the subject ought not to be brought before the public at all, and object to the very name being mentioned, and some of them have been endeavouring to alarm my good friend Mr. So-and-so, who has cautioned me to be careful whom I admit to these lectures. In reply to such persons, it is due to myself to say I am breaking no oath and violating no confidence. These lectures were advertised in the public journals, and all who chose to attend them are welcome. I regret to be obliged to differ from many persons whom I hold in the highest respect as to whether or not the times are ripe for mentioning these subjects. They have been mentioned, prudently or imprudently, and are familiar to all who have taken an interest in the Theosophical movement. What is more, they are being thought about, and I am convinced in my own mind that, under the circumstances, the continuation of the policy of total silence, hitherto observed, is less prudent than guarded speech. When we consider that an immense mass of knowledge has already been made public which, though to all appearance frozen at its source, must inevitably thaw in the coming century, I humbly submit that it is wiser to dig trenches than to risk a devastating flood. The first person, however, to profane the mysteries, albeit unconsciously, was Mr. Sinnett, the author of Esoteric Buddhism, a book which made considerable sensation when it came out, but which contains nothing new that is true, and nothing true that is new. As he was the first to make public the information that there is an eighth sphere, and a mystery connected with it of which he is ignorant, it may be as well to say that both these statements are true. But when he proceeds to say that the eighth sphere is the moon, he gives utterance to one of those half-truths that are more misleading than falsehoods, and as well give, as a definition of man, the aggregate of the chemical constituents of a decomposing body. The mystery is indeed the mystery of death. It is sevenfold, and each of the 7 mysteries is correlated to the sevenfold mystery of life on the 7 planes of consciousness. Readers of Esoteric Buddhism will remember that man is said therein to evolve on 7 planets, 3 of which, including the Earth, are visible, and the other 4 composed of matter too attenuated to be visible. Also that there is an 8th planet, the moon, in which matter asserts itself, yet more strongly than on the Earth. Anything more utterly misleading it is impossible to conceive. Madame Blavatsky, who knew very well that this kind of thing was sure to be exposed sooner or later, has, in her secret doctrine, corrected some of the errors, but as she has not chosen to elucidate any portions of the mystery except such as suit her purpose, and as she is destitute, moreover, of the literary gifts of her disciple, her teaching in respect to the 7 planets and the 8th sphere will be caviare to the general, who will continue to regard Mr. Sinnett's explanation as the genuine esoteric Buddhism. If my audience will kindly bear in mind that the esoteric doctrine is no more the peculiar property of Buddhists, Tibetan or European, than the moon itself, I will endeavour to throw what light I can on the subject. In the first place, the only visible planet on which man evolves is this Earth. He never inhabited Mars or Mercury or any of the visible planets, or was connected with any except the moon before it became a satellite. Every other planet in the solar system is ruled by its own angel of periods, and the evolution of the lower kingdoms of nature, animals excepted, is proceeding on them, or in connection with them, at different rates, in accordance with a law known as the law of acceleration and retardation. The fact of a planet being visible only shows that the fourth, or mineral kingdom, is at its fourth stage of evolution at such or such a distance from the sun. But, though man has nothing to do with Mars or Mercury in this sense, he has been connected in the past with 3 other worlds, and will in the future inhabit 3 more, which, with the Earth, will make 7. It is also true that an evolution of the lower kingdoms of nature is proceeding at different rates on the Earth, and what may be called its companion globes, to distinguish them from the planets proper. These companion globes are, of course, invisible, for they are all either above or below the material plane. The next thing to be remembered is that everything exists in 2 alternating states, which may be described as manifesting or active, and unmanifesting or potential. The Sanskrit words manvantara and pralaya are as good as any to denote these states, so we may as well use them. It should be borne in mind, however, that they are relative to the planes on which they occur. For example, when a human being is born into the world, he enters on his manvantara of earthly consciousness, and on his pralaya as regards his former state. Similarly, when he dies, he is in pralaya to the earth, and in manvantara to the world of superphysical concepts, which, by the way, is not devachan. Now, in order to understand the nature of man's evolution on Earth and its companion spheres, we must first ascertain his relation to other forms of life. Every planet, as I have said, is ruled by its own angel of periods, and every period is a concrete manifestation of cosmic energy, which represents the evolution of a kingdom of nature at a certain rate, which we may call X. Man, the highest kingdom, is the highest manifestation of cosmic energy in nature, for the angelic hierarchy are supernatural and belong to the realm of cosmic ideation. But every kingdom of nature contains within itself a certain proportion of all the others, potentially or actively, which are taken up in turn at each round on every successive globe of the chain, commencing with the second. For example, man is now evolving on the 4th globe of his planetary chain, on which he has arrived for the 4th time. On the 3 preceding rounds he was amorphous, for he only contained potentially the forces which have enabled him, at his present state of evolution, to subject to the law of his own being, the law of chemical affinity, which is a law of the 4th or mineral kingdom. The human body is an impossible chemical compound, for no sooner has the man cast it off than decomposition sets in. During his physical life, the law of chemical affinity is controlled by the higher biological law of selection and assimilation. And here, having cleared the ground of a multitude of misconceptions, I will endeavour to explain what the ape sphere really is. To do so, we must go very far back in the history of the cosmos, otherwise we shall be met by the objection that the existence of an ape sphere is contrary to Axiom 1. I said in the last lecture that the second triad in the celestial hierarchy, or trinity of generation, is composed of the male principle, Mahapurushka, or pre-cosmic ideation, the female principle, Mula Prakriti, or pre-cosmic substance, and their offspring, the Elohim, or creators, the highest beings, as we have seen, who can be spoken of as existing or capable of being differentiated from absolute being. Now, the very essence of existence or manifestation is duality. Hence they are divided into 2 classes, the powers of light and the powers of darkness. And here we find ourselves face to face with the great problem of the origin of evil, and how to reconcile its existence with the goodness of God. To the question, why does God permit evil, The theologian, strong in faith but weak in knowledge, returns the correct but irritating reply, "For his own glory." What is required, however, is a solution of the problem, and not an answer delivered ex cathedra. Unfortunately, the theologian, directly he begins to attempt a solution, falls into a pit at the very first step, the pit of dualism, which has been the curse of theology from the age of Augustine up to the present time. From this catastrophe a little knowledge would save him. Two is not, nor can it be, a symbol of perfection, for it implies difference or contrary. Monotheism and polytheism are both tenable systems teleologically, but ditheism is absolutely absurd and unworkable. On the other hand, two is the symbol of manifestation, or subjectivity and objectivity, and it is in the recognition of this fact that the solution of the problem of the origin of evil is to be found. Absolute good cannot, in the nature of things, be manifest except to itself. To all finite conceptions, relativity is necessary. We can only know light by comparing it with shade, and good by comparing it with evil. There can be no such thing as absolute evil, for it would be the negation of absolute good, which is God. All evil is therefore relative, or conditioned by time, which is the medium of illusion, and is the negation of relative goodness. But relative goodness is imperfection, and the negation of imperfection is perfection. Therefore evil is perfection, or God, which is absurd. But God is the all-in-one, therefore if evil be not God, it is nothing. QED. Why callest thou me good? Said the Master. There is none good but one, that is God. Be ye perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Let theologians who wish to understand the mystery of evil ponder these two sayings, for in the reconciliation of them the solution lies. Free will is an ignis fatuus, a deceptive light, and those who follow it will, sooner or later, find themselves in the cul-de-sac of fatalism or the pit of dualism. It is not, however, with the metaphysical so much as the historical aspect of the problem that we have now to deal. The cosmos is temporal, as I have said, in its aspect of manifestation to finite intelligences. That is, it had a beginning, or an evolutionary stage behind which we cannot go, the former stages being unthinkable, though not on that account less real. The present cosmic Manvantara is the manifestation of the divine love. It was preceded by the cosmos of divine wisdom, which lived, moved, and had its being on a supernatural plane of consciousness, and culminated in a race of exalted beings who manifest collectively in the new era as the Elohim, or powers of light. But, as we have seen, manifested light implies darkness. What then are the powers of darkness? If evil be imperfection, they are imperfect manifestations of the divine wisdom. If you will bear in mind the Oriental division of the Dhyanis, or celestial beings, into two classes, the ascending and descending, you will recognize the powers of darkness as entities on the ascending arc of this cycle of divine wisdom, which they had not completed before its period of pralaya had set in. But as they have progressed too far to be thrown back into the vortex of a new primordial evolution, they return, during the cosmic pralaya, to their static condition, and remain as a latent force until the next cosmic Manvantara, when, at a certain stage of its development, they mingle with the progressed entities of the new period, and complete their evolution vicariously. It is here that a certain law, called the law of acceleration and retardation, produces equilibrium in a way that I will presently explain. The law of A and R may be thus stated. All evolution proceeds in cycles. During the first half of each cycle, its rate is subject to a gradual diminution, which, if the initial velocity be represented by x, culminates in x/7. It then increases in the same proportion that it diminished its final corresponding with its initial velocity, the whole series being expressed in multiples of 7. Let us remember that the Dhyanis of the former period were on the ascending arc of their cycle and complete their evolution in an ever-increasing ratio of acceleration, whereas the Dhyanis who had already completed their cycle and manifest in the new period as the Elohim, or powers of light, were subject to the law of retardation, being on the descending arc of the new cycle. Now the forces on different planes of consciousness which go to make up man ultimately resolve themselves into two vortices which represent his higher and his lower nature, and if we take the lemniscate for his symbol, in perusance of our method, his relation to cosmos, in accordance with axiom 2, will be represented by the following figure, the lemniscate. The larger curves symbolizing the macrocosm and the smaller the microcosm. How is this figure produced? It is the result of three forces. Each coil is composed of a series of spirals representing in their turn the elements in the developing process, whereby the nominal becomes the phenomenal. But the point of intersection is a dead center, and a third factor is required by the conditions of the problem. For the point of intersection corresponds to the will, or the middle principle between the higher and the lower nature, and in order that the point may become a circle or manifest, it requires to be crossed by the axis of a fresh vortex at another angular incidence. Now this circle is in reality a sphere, the eighth sphere, but it cannot be expressed in any other than two-dimensional terms consistently with the illustration, which is necessarily imperfect. The lemniscate is projected in three-dimensional or phenomenal space, whereas the cosmogenical operations of nature are not thus restricted, but extend into what is known as the region of permeability. For this reason, the mystery of the eighth sphere must always remain a mystery to the uninitiated, and even to the initiated below a certain grade, as its comprehension requires the development of perceptive faculties latent in the majority of men. In Mr. Crookes' scheme of physicogenesis, the difficulty is surmounted by the introduction of the element of temperature, a lowering of which produces contraction. But temperature is itself an effect of motion in the region of permeability, so that even the physical genesis requires that the third factor, space, be accompanied by a fourth, a lowering of temperature. Still, however imperfect the illustration may be for our present purpose, and only shadowing forth, as it were, on a screen, the outline of the reality, it may assist us to apprehend somewhat of the mystery of the eighth sphere, so far as its operations come within the range of intellectual process. Let us first consider what is called the torsion of impact, or the effect produced when two vortices meet whose axes impinge at an angle. If the medium of the two be of equal density, and their velocity be also equal, they coalesce and form a parabolic figure, but if their velocity be not equal, they form two conical spheroids revolving in opposite directions, corresponding to the figure of 8, which we have selected as the symbol of man's evolution. This, it will be seen, meets the conditions involved, for it will be remembered that the ascending Dhyanis of the former period complete their evolution, in this cosmic Manvantara, under the law of acceleration, whereas the Dhyanis, who manifest as the powers of light, are on the descending arc of their cycle, and are subject to the law of retardation. Accordingly, the vortices which respectively represent their activities are of unequal velocity. We have now arrived at that portion of the mystery which relates to the moon. It is expressed technically thus. when the macrocosm and the microcosm meet for the fourth time at the point of intersection, 4, the cosmos or generation, is wedded to 5, the evil number, or as Madame Blavatsky would say, when man has completed the third round of his planetary chain and began his fourth, the centrifugal force of the new vortex, acting in the mineral or fourth kingdom of nature, projects into space a portion of globe, D, or the fourth of the chain, which revolves round it as its satellite. Madame Blavatsky, in her secret doctrine, makes a great point of the fact that the moon is older than the earth, and that Jehovah is a lunar deity. It is difficult for anyone who knows the truth to read this part of her work without admiring the extraordinary ability, but at the same time noting the extraordinary unscrupulousness with which she contrives to insinuate that Jehovah is the god of impurity and grossness, and his adversary the true benefactor of mankind. It may be admitted that Jehovah Michael was the god of human generation, and that his number is 4, the tetragrammaton, and that his adversary was Lucifer, the light-bearer and lord of human wisdom. But is generation an evil thing? It is blasphemy to assert it a doctrine of demons, as St. Paul says. For generation is the last expression of love on the material plane. Whatever of impurity or grossness attaches itself to the idea is mind-born. Shakespeare uttered a profound truth in the person of Hamlet when he made him say, "There's nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so." Adultery and fornication are bad because they are disorderly. Corruptio optimi pessima. All disorder in the external world springs from cyclical aberration on the plane of spirit, and the author of cyclical aberration is the light-bearer in his character of Stephanos, the adversary, the usurping prince of this world. For it must be remembered that Lucifer Stephanos belongs to the order of principalities, and his period is the evolution of human reason. It may be asked why the powers of darkness manifest in the person of the light-bearer. The answer is because they manifest on the plane of illusion. The light over which they proceed is human reason, and it is deceptive because all reasoning is conditioned by time, or the medium of illusion. It is, however, only a question of degree. As all evil is imperfection, and absolute evil the negation of God or nothing, asat, so absolute darkness is not, and cannot be, except during a cosmic praelaya. This is apparent from the allegory of Genesis. When the Elohim said, "Let there be light," it was necessary in order that the light should be manifest to divide it from the darkness. Accordingly, they made, manifested as, 2 great lights, the sun to govern the day and the moon to govern the night. Now this must not be taken to mean the material sun and moon, for it has reference to a period ages and ages before the universe existed in a material form. The sun stands for the collective Elohim, and the moon for Javeh Elohim, reflecting in the person of the angel of the Lord the divine light of the Sun of Righteousness until the period of his manifestation. And now we see why Jehovah was a lunar deity. Emanating from the Logos, or being on the highest plane of consciousness, he manifests in the person of his angel until the culmination of his period, which is the period of darkness or illusion. St. Paul, as an initiate, well understood this, but he was precluded from stating it otherwise than indirectly. Hence his laboured attempt in the Epistle to the Romans to demonstrate that we are not under the law by which sin came, working all manner of concupiscence. For I know, he says, Romans chapter 7, verse 18, that in me, that is in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. His fellow apostle might well say, "Our beloved brother Paul hath written many things hard to be understood, which the unlearned wrest to their own destruction." For in the 7th chapter of his epistle to the Romans he seems to contradict himself over and over again. What his argument really comes to is this. Man has a higher and a lower nature, and in the lower nature there is a law of concupiscence, karma rupa, warring against the higher, the inward man or true self. But God is the author of the lower as well as of the higher self. Did God then create sin? No, he says, verse 8, for without the law sin was dead. But when the commandment came, sin revived and I died, verse 9. God then is not the author of sin, but of the law which was ordained. He says elsewhere, Galatians chapter 3, verse 19, by angels in the hand of a mediator. But why was it ordained if, though in itself holy, just and good, the consequence was evil? In order, he replies, that sin might appear sin or become manifest. In other words, the point of intersection in our symbolical lemniscate, which represents the will or middle principle between man's higher and lower nature, expanded into manifestation under the centrifugal impetus caused by the impact of the fresh and more rapid vortex which was set up by the ascending Dhyanis of the former period, hastening, under the law of acceleration, to complete their evolution vicariously in the new cosmos. This was the first fall or descent into matter of the angels who mingled their essence with the most progressed of the material forms, into whom Yahweh had breathed the breath of life. Genesis chapter 2, verse 7. The will of man became manifest, therefore, by the evolution of his reason, and the immediate effect was the knowledge of good and evil. Behold, said Jehovah, the man has become as one of us, the Elohim. Now, lest he take of the tree of life and live forever, i.e., lest he evolve into spirituality under the law of acceleration. Therefore Jehovah sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken. From which it is evident that the Garden of Eden was not on earth at all. The Mohammedans have a tradition which is singularly near the truth, namely that the Garden of Eden was in the middle region between the earth and the moon. The facts are these. Differentiation on the plane of spirit precedes differentiation on the physical plane, and is from the lowest to the highest kingdom of nature. At the time of the fall, man had assimilated to the laws of his own being the free elemental kingdoms of nature which precede the mineral kingdom. He was a descending Dhyani at the fourth stage of his evolution, or, as Madame Blavatsky would say, had evolved for the fourth time on the first three globes, A, B, and C of his chain, and had commenced his evolution on D, the fourth, our Earth. Now every kingdom of nature corresponds to a principle in man, and every principle, as I've said before, is correlated to a principle in the cosmos. The fourth principle in the cosmos is the divine will, and by it man evolved his fourth principle, karma rupa, or body of desire, on the three planes of consciousness below the physical plane. Now, in accordance with axiom 2, the first three stages of his evolution on the physical plane were a reproduction, microcosmic in point of time, of his evolution on the three preceding planes, just as the individual human fetus, during the few months that elapse between conception and parturition, runs the whole gourmet of evolutionary progress from mineral to human being. Accordingly, when man first appeared on this earth, he was materially undifferentiated, the Adam Kadmon of the Kabbalah. He had not descended into matter, and it was at this time that the vortices manifested in macrocosm in the mineral kingdom, causing a projection into space of a portion of globe D, which then became the vehicle of his body of desire. Let us be very careful to remember that this is a projection in space, and in no way affects the shape of the symbolical lemniscate, for it takes place at the point of intersection. The centrifugal and centripetal forces which give birth to the spirals of which the figure is composed are not on the physical plane, and only touch it at that point. The spirals which represent his lower principles converge toward, and those which represent his higher diverge from. This point, and are respectively above and below the physical plane, for as above stated, the conical spheroids, resulting from the impact of two vortices of unequal velocity, revolve in opposite directions. The point, then, towards which man tends in the first half of his evolution, and from which he rises in the second, is Maya, or illusion. His body of desire, therefore, or the faculty by which he comes into relation with the material or illusory world, and makes the laws which govern it the laws of his own being, is the will, or middle principle, and is consequently itself an illusion. Man's will is free in the sense that the physical world is real, and in no other. This descent into matter, or accidental coincidence of the macrocosm and the microcosm, when the former had arrived at its fourth, or mineral stage, therefore took place in equilibrio between the two globes, the earth and the moon, the separation of which in the mineral kingdom resulted from the impact of the two vortices. This is as much as I am able to divulge in regard to the mystery of the eighth sphere, so far as it concerns the moon. But I hope I have made it clear, 1. That the moon is not the eighth sphere, except in the lowest material sense. 2. That whatever of evil attaches itself to the idea of generation is mind-born and cannot be imputed to Jehovah. And 3. That what we call evil is only the cyclic law of retardation, manifesting on the plane of illusion, and that this is due to the axial opposition of the two vortices, and will disappear when their axes coincide. It cannot be too often repeated that evil is only positive when reflected in Maya. On the plane of spirit, it is simply the negation of relative good or imperfection. The powers of darkness are not in themselves evil, for they are emanations of the divine wisdom. But they manifest imperfectly because, not having completed their cycle, they are conditioned by time. The same, however, applies to the powers of light who are on the descending arc of the cycle of divine love, and who manifest equally as imperfect representatives of the latter. It is this imperfection, in itself negative, which, reflected in Maya, becomes antagonism and is analogous to the darkness produced by the interference of waves of light. But as we have seen, the two streams of tendency unite in man. In him and through him will the universe evolve until it becomes the perfect expression of the divine love. St. Paul well understood this when he said, "The whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain until now, waiting for the adoption, to wit, the redemption of the body," which will take place coincidentally with the manifestation on the plane of Maya of the sons of God. Romans chapter 8, verse 19. These are the Hindu Agnishvara, or sons of fire, pure Akasha, which is the sixth principle of the cosmos. Their manifestation is the destruction of the temporal or illusory in the consuming fire of the divine love, which, on the plane of Maya, is the divine wrath. What will happen is this. The powers of darkness, who can only manifest in axial opposition, deprived of their centrifugal energy, will return to their static condition of latency. The centripetal force of the eighth sphere will then irresistibly draw into its vortex the residuum of material energy on globe D, which will then enter its first stage of obscuration, or planetary pralaya. Of the 16 stages of degradation which will be the lot of those whose wills have become assimilated with the material energy of the planet, it is not necessary here to speak, except to say that they will be left behind in the evolutionary progress, as it were, by their own weight. In the next lecture I shall endeavour to show how the anomaly of the double vortex will disappear under the law of acceleration, but before leaving this part of the subject, it is necessary to add a few words on the subject of the second fall of the angels, which was altogether of a different character from the first. It was a fall of the angels of light, the sons of God, who saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and united themselves to them in the bonds of matter. This fall from heavenly to earthly love brought them immediately under the dominion of Satan, the prince of this world, and inaugurated on earth the reign of physical and intellectual force. This union of intellect and form was the origin of the arts and sciences. Civilization advanced by leaps and bounds, but it was a curse rather than a blessing. By the time the fourth root race, with its physical and intellectual giants, had reached the apex of its development, the whole earth was filled with violence, and the great cataclysmic period, known as the Flood, and preserved in the traditions of all nations, swept them and their children away. These semi-human creatures, the progeny of the fallen angels, are known in the Hindu scripts as the Asuras, and are sometimes called Rakshasas or demons. But they are quite distinct from the offspring of the incubi and succubi, who spring from the element of water. Not, of course, material water, but the aqueous or static principle of the universe. The Asuras are igneous, or dynamic in their nature, and their power for evil was terrific. It was destroyed forever by the advent of Jesus Christ, and they are now, as St. Jude puts it, reserved in everlasting chains until the judgment of the great day. Stated in scientific terms, they are held in check, unable to move backward or forward between the Earth and the ape sphere at the point of latency, where the attraction of both is equal on all planes, until the great day of accidental coincidence, when they will be drawn irresistibly into the vortex of the latter. This text in St. Jude has been unfortunately misunderstood, and supposed to apply to Lucifer and the first fall of the angels, hence the Miltonic and medieval myths. The Transcendental Universe by C.G. Harrison. This is lecture 6. I said in a former lecture that the whole science of occultism is built on the recognition of the reality, or permanence, of the noumenon, and the illusory or transitory character of the phenomenon. Physical science occupies itself wholly with phenomena, and relegates noumena to the region of the unknowable. This is, however, only an intermediate phase of thought. For the last 300 years, modern science has been developing and consolidating its body of phenomenal facts, and has at length arrived at a point which will necessitate a new departure in its methods. The conclusion, viz., that force is the homogeneous basis of the material universe. The intellectual evolution indicated by the great scientific progress of the post-Reformation era is the result of a spiritual involutionary process which began with Augustine and ended with Calvin, for a period of intellectual renaissance is always accompanied by a spiritual decadence. It would lead me far beyond the limits assigned to this lecture if I were to endeavour to account for this. Suffice it to say that it is connected with the mystery of birth and death, one of the 7 great mysteries called the unutterable, seeing that they cannot be explained in words, but necessitate the employment of a symbolic system, the nature of which I am not at liberty to explain. The spiritual involution, which culminated in the worship of force under the name of the Almighty, gave birth to inductive reasoning and inaugurated a period of intellectual evolution whose cycle is nearly completed. Determinism in theology and materialism in science have a similar origin on the plane of spirit. But a new era has begun to dawn. Neither science nor theology can rest in a reductio ad absurdum. The irresistible logic of Calvin was not proof against the revolt of the moral sense, and the clearest demonstration by physiologists that mental states and moral affinities have their chemical equivalents will never persuade men to believe that the brain secretes thought as the liver secretes bile. This is beginning to be pretty generally recognized, and accordingly Some of our scientific men are experimenting with a view to ascertain the relations which electrical conditions, set up in the human body by the action of will, bear towards similar conditions in inorganic substances. From this it is an easy step to cosmic ideation. The mystery of force would be solved when we learn to regard it as the intermediate condition between the subjective volition and the objective act. The unmanifested idea becomes manifest in the objective phenomenon through the medium of force, which may be defined, therefore, as the passage between the noumenon and the phenomenon, or the noumenon in process of manifestation. As force cannot be conceived apart from matter, or will apart from intelligence, it follows that the material universe has its origin in cosmic ideation. The recognition of this principle is tantamount to an acknowledgment of the reality or permanence of the noumenon, and when this idea has received its imprimatur at the hands of our scientists, the conflict between religion and science will come to an end, for they will have a common foundation in sacramentalism. The universe is, in truth, the outward and visible sign of a conflict between two eternal principles, light and love, in which the noumena of all phenomena have their origin. The principles are eternal, but their conflict is temporary. Hence, the fashion of this world passeth away, its archetypal forms being themselves subject to change. Evolution in the physical universe is the sacramental expression of cosmic progress in wisdom, and beauty the sacramental index of its conformity to the divine ideal. But behind it lies a mysterious involution of the divine nature, which found its ultimate expression in obedience unto death, even the death of the cross. And both were necessary in order that the divine love should become fully manifested, for duality is an essential element of manifestation. This is the fourth of the seven great mysteries, the mystery of birth and death. I feel myself somewhat at a disadvantage in dealing with this subject, for while nothing is further from my wishes than to profane the higher mysteries, it is absolutely necessary to correct certain false notions in regard to the relations between God and man, for which the teachings of Madame Blavatsky are responsible. For example, nearly everyone who accepts the cosmogony of the Theosophical Society has formed a mental picture of 6 globes, of a more or less gaseous consistency, which are the companion planets of the earth and revolve round the sun, in the same way as the visible planets, at a distance of so many miles from it and from each other. Now this is entirely wrong. No globes answering to such a description exist, at least as having any connection with the earth. The fact is, the 7 planets are separated from the earth and from each other, not by miles, but by intermolecular constitution. Viewed from the standpoint of the highest consciousness in nature, or cosmic ideation, a visible planet, our Earth for instance, is the concrete expression of the 4th stage of the divine idea, which is complete in 7 stages, or the mineral kingdom. It contains potentially the 3 higher kingdoms, and accordingly they manifest in connection with it, under its own molecular law of crystallization. But the forces which held together Globe C, or the world of archetypal forms, were much weaker than on this earth, the mineral idea, so to speak, having only arrived at its 3rd stage. Plants, animals, and men existed on it only in their ethereal forms. Similarly, on Globe E, which, on the 5th round, is the expression of the 5th stage of the divine idea, the mineral kingdom will enter on its period of pralaya, and the law of crystallization will give place to the biological law of selection, when man arrives on it for the 5th time. As in Globe D, the mineral idea becomes manifest on the 4th plane of consciousness, of phenomenal space, this being the 4th round, so the plant idea will attain to the same development on Globe E in the 5th round. In other words, man will then have entered on a period in which the recognition of his solidarity, or what is called our common humanity, will not depend on community of flesh and blood, but on community of will. He will exist on an altogether higher plane of consciousness, in which the illusion that the good of the individual can, by any possibility, be separated from the good of the whole will have no place. Man will have subjected to the law of his own being what I've called the plant idea, or the law of organic life, as, in this world, he has subjected the mineral idea, or the law of chemical affinity, which constitutes our present bond of union with each other, our common flesh and blood. And this community of will, consequent on the perfect development of the fifth principle in man, will be brought about by his incorporation into the sixth principle of the cosmos, Maha-Buddhi, or the Christ principle. The words of St. Paul, "Not I, but Christ which is in me," will then express the highest form of mental activity, or the divine reason manifesting through the human reason. This digression from the subject immediately before us was necessary to clear our minds from the false notion that there is any break of continuity in man's evolution, such as the idea of a journey to another planet would imply. He does not, when he has completed his evolution on this earth, fly off into interplanetary space, as Mr. Sinnett suggests in Esoteric Buddhism, and arrive at Globe E. He grows away from Globe D and into Globe E, in the same way that he grew away from the archetypal world into that of actual form. Indeed, it would be more correct to say that the earth leaves man than that man leaves the earth, for when the fifth stage of the divine idea is reached, the fourth ceases to manifest, and the commencement of the fifth round is the first stage of obscuration, or planetary pralaya of Globe D. Thus it is that the idea of man being on the earth and confined to it only holds good of his lower nature, or body of illusion. The terms higher and lower have no real, that is, eternal significance. The double vortex is a manifestation in time, or the plane of illusion, and is the result of cyclic aberration on the plane of spirit. Having disposed of this fundamental error, let us endeavour to ascertain the true meaning of the account of man's creation and fall, which, in the book of Genesis, is presented in the form of an allegory of so dramatic a character that it has been taken by the ignorant for a record of literal facts, with disastrous results both to religion and morality. Even where its allegorical character has been admitted, it has been grievously misinterpreted. The story of the forbidden fruit is a parable of the evolution of the human reason, and, unless we are prepared to assert that reason is in itself a bad thing, we shall do well to dismiss from our minds all poetic fictions in which the fall is represented as a punishment for sin, and regard the whole story in an entirely different light. It is not generally known that between the events described in the first and second chapters of Genesis there is an enormous interval of time. The Elohistic Sabbath, or return of the emanations to their static condition of unmanifested latency, each being received back into the Logos in the culmination of its period. The second chapter opens with the period of Javeh Elohim, Lord of Form and Ruler of the Night, which preceded the present Elohistic day, over which the Sun of Righteousness presides. An Elohistic day corresponds to what the Theosophists call a round period, and this is the fourth in the new series. Yahweh was, therefore, the reflection of the divine love on the plane of illusion. It was he who formed man out of the dust of the earth and breathed into him the nephesh, or animal soul. The purpose of this was twofold. One, that the nascent personality might be held in equilibrium and preserved from absorption into the ape sphere. And two, as a preparation for his future destiny of dominion over the lower kingdoms of nature, that through him the universe may evolve until it becomes the perfect expression of the divine love. This will be better understood if we avoid the error of a time connection between the first and second chapters of Genesis. For the first chapter embraces the whole cosmic Manvantara, the divine idea, from its primal differentiation in the region of the Absolute to its fullest expansion in time, or the sixth day, when God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good, or more correctly, the best. Verse 31. The first chapter of Genesis is the history of the cosmos, past, present, and future, on the plane of spirit, which is now expanding into objectivity, and this expansion is a reflection of the spiritual reality. Accordingly, in the second chapter, we find the order reversed. Yahweh is represented as forming Adam first, and afterward the brute creation, bringing them to him to see what he would call them, verse 19, and finally the sex principle, symbolized in the first chapter as the division of the upper and lower waters, evolves into objectivity. This is the third round of period of humanity, or the third Elohistic day from one point of view, but it also corresponds to the minor cycle in the planetary Manvantara, or the third root race, which is a microcosmic copy of it, for humanity, in the first three root rates of this round, repeats the process by which it evolved in the first three rounds. I have said that the progressed entities of the former cycle, the cycle of divine wisdom, complete their evolution in the new period under the law of acceleration, by incarnating in the monads who had received the breath of life, or animal soul, from Yahweh Elohim, the Lord of Form, and representative of that stage of the divine love which, being the fourth in the series, was subject to the law of retardation. These monads are known in India as the seven Pitris, or enlighteners, and are the lords of human wisdom. But though they were incarnations of the powers of darkness, it would be an abuse of words to call them evil, for to them man owes speech and the power to reason. By virtue of their sixth principle, which they had developed in their own cosmic Manvantara, they were in a position to control the fifth principle in their new condition, and awaken the dormant faculty of reasoning in their adopted brethren. Now the first material race, the third root race of this round, were in a very real sense the first men, for, though the feral races who preceded them had developed will, the spiritual forces, which, manifesting vortically downward toward the next or human plane of consciousness, were the immediate or efficient causes of man's will, were themselves radiations from the unconditioned cause, the divine will. Man was a mere image or reflection of God, and his will an illusion, a shadow of the divine will projected in Maya. Not until the fourth round was the human personality, so to speak, born, or detached from the life of its parents, the Elohim. Man, to have an independent existence, must be self-centered, or free to originate his own actions, and it is evident that this could not be if the evolution of his reason had proceeded on the same lines. Hence the necessity for a readjustment, whereby his personality, or fifth principle, might become itself a controlling impulse. The mystery of free will is, in truth, the mystery of human personality, and this, as we have seen, has its source in the divine love, which requires an object in order that it may become manifest. We can only conceive of will as the dynamic effect of personality, manifesting objectively. In itself it has no existence, for it is neither subject nor object, but a middle category necessitated by the laws of thought. In all finite personalities, the will is the centre of gravity, a mathematical point. In God, the infinite personality, there is no centre, or rather the centre is everywhere, for in him subjective and objective are one, and in manifestation both comprehend all that is. It is easy to see, therefore, that the projection of will in Maya must be accompanied by a projection of Mayavic personality in order that it may become manifest or present an objective side. The centre must be located, hence the apparent opposition between the will of man and the will of God. As the will of God is the centre from which force radiates, passing in turn through every plane of consciousness, this apparent opposition will disappear when the personality, or fifth principle, of man shall be sufficiently developed to obtain full control over the forces which have thrown into objectivity his lower principles, and which have resulted in the anomaly of the double vortex. An anomaly because its centre resides in the fourth or Mayavic stage of the divine idea concerning him. Our investigations have therefore led us to this point, that man, as he is at present constituted, is the resultant of two vortices manifesting dynamically on the plane of illusion, and proceeding originally from two separate streams of tendency, the one representing divine love and the other the divine wisdom, which, meeting on the plane of human consciousness, coalesce into an objective personality, imperfect as a reflection of the divine personality, inasmuch as its centre is located in Maya. This imperfection is due to a disturbance of the medium through which it manifests, and is the temporary result of the impact of the two vortices, as the reflection of a light in water is duplicated when the surface is disturbed. It is desirable here to anticipate an objection which may be raised to this illustration. Why, it may be said, should the term Maya be applied to the fourth stage of the evolutionary series in the macrocosm, when it may be predicated equally of the whole series? The answer is to be found in the etymology of the word. It is a contraction of Maya Aya. Ya signifies being, A is the privative particle, and Maha is great. Maya, therefore, signifies the great is not, but the term great is relative and applies to the objective universe on each plane of consciousness. We may therefore speak of Maya in its fourth degree, which is the universal form, or all that pertains to three-dimensional space, and is limited by time. It is in this sense that I use the word for our present illustration. But though from a metaphysical point of view we may regard the objective universe as Mayavic, yet it has for us a real existence, inasmuch as our human personality is still within the sphere of its attraction. The first step towards the recognition of its true character as essentially illusory will be taken when man shall have sufficiently developed his fifth principle to enable him to overcome this attraction. In other words, when the centrifugal force of his lower nature shall become subject to the centripetal force of his higher nature. At present they are in equilibrio in the average man for all practical purposes, though in comparing individuals we may observe a slight preponderance one way or the other. When the centripetal preponderance is very marked, the individual is regarded by the majority as a visionary enthusiast or a dangerous fanatic. When, on the other hand, the animal nature is not under proper control, the human beast must be caged in the interests of society. Until the divine reflection is recovered from the shock produced in its medium by the impact of the two vortices, man must continue to manifest as a double vortex with a centre of its own. But it is easy to see that this condition cannot be otherwise than temporary. The law of acceleration which enabled the powers of darkness to traverse successfully the manifestation of the divine love on the plane of illusion, by opposing to it their own more rapid vortex, must necessarily give place to the law of retardation in the new figure thus thrown into objectivity. Having exhausted itself in the centrifugal impulse which gave birth to the eighth sphere, and in the mineral kingdom was the cause of the moon becoming a satellite of the earth, the tendency of the vortex is to return to its static condition of latency which tendency manifests dynamically in the attraction of the ape sphere. On the other hand, the Dhyanis, proceeding from the Elohim of light, who descended into matter, under the cyclic law of retardation, began to ascend immediately afterwards. The law of acceleration then asserted itself, and by the time that the fourth root race had reached the apex of its development, was sufficiently powerful to successfully resist the attraction of the ape sphere, and preserve the double vortex from absorption into it. This is one aspect of the law of cataclysms referred to in esoteric Buddhism, which are as periodic as the swing of a pendulum. They occur at the end of every root race because the principalities, or angels of periods, of the succeeding one are then evolving at their minimum rate, having completed one half of their minor cycle. At such times, the centripetal resistance to the attraction of the ape sphere is at its weakest. These periods coincide with the precession of the equinoxes. The last was the end of the glacial epoch in the northern hemisphere, and is preserved in the memory of a universal flood in the traditions of all nations. But it is with the preceding cataclysm in the third root race that we are now concerned, called by theologians the fall, and by the occultists the descent into matter. It is symbolized in the book of Genesis as expulsion from paradise, rest or spiritual equilibrium, and the curse pronounced on the earth for man's sake was not the arbitrary decree of an offended deity, but the natural and inevitable result of the shock caused by the impact of the vortices, which brought all lower forms of life within the attraction of the ape sphere, and consequently under lunar influences. It was coincident with the evolution of sex. Hence it is often called the fall into generation. The phenomena of gestation and parturition being intimately connected with lunar phases and following the course of lunar cycles. The races which preceded what Madame Blavatsky calls the Numero-Atlanteans were differently constituted from later man, and reproduced themselves by a law analogous to that which governs the production of materialized forms in the spirit cycle, with this important difference, that the form was permanent, or at least persistent. With the fall into generation, man became subject to the law of heredity, and this is the foundation of the much misunderstood doctrine of original sin, which, according to its popular interpretation, is a monstrous libel on the divine being. Had man not fallen into generation, the divine purpose concerning him would not have been fulfilled. On the one hand, the double vortex would have been absorbed in the ape sphere, or on the other, the principalities of light would have infused into him a portion of their own spiritual essence, and caused him to evolve rapidly, under the law of acceleration, out of materiality into a state of pure and self-dependent spiritual existence. In the one case his material, and in the other his spiritual personality would have been destroyed. But the principalities of light, perfect and blessed emanations of the divine wisdom, recognized in the divine love a purpose above and beyond anything that the highest wisdom could attain to. It was no less than the redemption of the body by sacrifice, and before this mystery they cast their crowns of wisdom at the feet of the mystic Lamb, and bowed their faces in adoration. They might have redeemed man's soul, they could not redeem his body. Accordingly, they submitted to the law of their cycle and became angels of periods, each period being a progressive manifestation of the divine love, which was to prepare the way for its perfect manifestation in the Word made flesh. Now the period of the Jewish dispensation, or that ruled over by the principalities proceeding from Yahweh, Lord of Form, was essentially the period of generation. It had for its object the consolidation of humanity on the basis of that sympathetic relation which we call natural affection, in order that through it man might rise to the conception of the divine fatherhood. Accordingly, the solidarity of the human race found its natural expression in that community of feeling in which we recognize our essential brotherhood, and also in the law of inherited tendencies by which the equilibrium of the double vortex is preserved. Against this law, the principalities of darkness, under the guidance of Lucifer, prince of this world, have opposed their most powerful forces, but, as we shall see, with only partial success. It is generally supposed that Satan is the enemy of spirituality in man, that he delights in his degradation and views with diabolical satisfaction the development of his lower nature and all its evil consequences. The wide and almost universal prevalence of this medieval superstition only makes it all the more necessary to protest against it as a grotesque error. As well might we say that the object at which Napoleon aimed was the slaughter of as many French soldiers as possible. It is related of Napoleon that he wept bitterly when, on the night succeeding the Battle of Austerlitz, he rode over the field and viewed the dead and dying, and it would probably be much nearer the truth to say that the degradation and suffering of mankind, for which the adversary of God is responsible, so far from affording him any satisfaction, afflicts him with a sense of failure and deepens his despair of ultimate victory. Let us examine this diabolical delusion in the light of revelation and common sense. How can any rational being delight in evil for its own sake? Such delight is the negation of rationality, and the nearest approach to such a conception is the homicidal maniac. It is admitted that Satan is not only a rational being, but an intelligence of a far higher order than our own. To suppose, therefore, that his chief characteristic is insensate ferocity is surely absurd, without, of course, pressing the analogy, if we were compelled to choose between Napoleon the Great and the Whitechapel murderer as a representative of the usurping prince of this world. Nobody who reflects for a moment would hesitate, not even those who call the latter a fiend in human shape. If we turn to Revelation, what do we find? St. Peter, it is true, compares him to a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour, or in other words, whose nature he may assimilate to his own. He is also called the father of lies or illusions, for it was through his instrumentality that man's personality came under the dominion of Maya. Everywhere else he is the symbol of pure, cold intellect. In the book of Job, the oldest extant dramatic allegory, he is represented as the author of the cynical assertion that love is only a form of self-interest, and we are left to imagine his astonishment at the words of Job, "Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him." In the genetic allegory he is symbolized as the serpent, everywhere the emblem of wisdom, and enlightenment was the immediate consequence of eating the forbidden fruit. He is, in fact, Lucifer the light-bearer, and to him man owes the faculty of intellectual discrimination, or the knowledge of good and evil under illusory conditions. He is the manifestation, in time, of the fifth or intellectual principle of the cosmos, and, in virtue of this limitation, is incapable of conceiving any higher good than wisdom. We must be careful, however, to distinguish between the 7 cosmic principles and their microcosmic manifestations, each of which is a complete sub-series. Thus, Lucifer is a fully developed septenary being, representing the 5th principle of the universe or cosmic ideation, and striving to attain to omnipotence through control of the 4th, Maha-Maya. Now this is not spiritual evolution or life, as at first sight it might appear, but involution, or the spiritual principle of death. This is exceedingly difficult to explain, but it must be remembered that evolution is progress in time, and is the reflection in Maya of a spiritual reality which is not so conditioned. Lucifer is not the fifth cosmic principle itself, but its efflorescence in time. He is the seed of the fifth human principle, and germination is an involuntary process as regards the seed itself. Except a kernel of wheat fall into the ground and die, it bringeth forth no fruit, though evolutionary as regards the nascent plant. This view is quite in accordance with our original position that evil has no real, i.e. eternal, existence, but is an imperfect or lower goodness. What, then, was the design which the author of evil on this planet set himself to accomplish? It was no less than the elevation of man to his own spiritual level, in order that through him the cosmos might become the perfect expression of pure intellect. It was a magnificent ideal worthy of a son of light, but it was doomed to failure. A yet higher glory was in store for man. He was destined for adoption, that, becoming a partaker of the divine nature, the universe through him might evolve into the perfect expression of love, or God himself. Accordingly, the light-bearer found himself confronted with a law of inertia sufficiently powerful to resist even his mighty will. His labours resembled those of Sisyphus. Having united his fate with man, his future is bound up with man's intellectual progress, and this is subject to a rhythmical cyclic and subcyclic ebb and flow, consequent on the periodic law of acceleration and retardation. It battles his utmost efforts, and is the cause of that strange oscillation between the positive and negative poles of spiritual wisdom which, reflected in Maya, is the conflict of good and evil. But this antagonism is essential to the perfect revelation of the divine nature, or, in other words, the omnipotence of love. That God is love is no Oriental metaphor, but a plain, literal statement containing the key to all mysteries. The existence of evil, it is often said, is a proof that either the goodness or the power of God is limited. We refuse to impale ourselves on either horn of the dilemma. The existence of evil is a proof that God is not will or wisdom, but love. If the omnipotence of God were displayed in his will, there would be no freedom, and consequently no personality for the creature. If wisdom were the highest good, an immeasurable chasm would forever have separated the creature from the Creator. For the most exalted spiritual condition is only a form of life, excluding of necessity all lower forms, and proceeding from the Lord and Giver of all life. But God has chosen to reveal himself as love, hence the necessity of freedom on the part of man to choose between good and evil. For, were he not free, he would be incapable of reciprocating that love. Here, however, we are met by a difficulty. All material effects have their origin in spiritual causes, and we have seen that positive evil, on the material plane, is the result of cyclic aberration on the plane of spirit, consequent on the impact of two vortical streams of tendency, producing a disturbance in the medium through which the human consciousness manifests objectively. Thus it is that the fifth principle, or seat of human personality, is subject to a periodic cyclic and subcyclic law of attraction toward the fourth, or body of desire, which, owing to its own imperfect development, it is incapable of fully controlling. But the question arises, if this attraction toward the lower nature or body of desire is the cause of suffering and death, must it not be considered as in itself an evil condition? By no means, for it produces also pleasure and life, which we can only know by their opposites, and secondly, pleasure and pain are only finite correlatives of the eternal principles of good and evil. It is against this law of inertia in the double vortex that the adversary of God and man rebels. In vain does he attempt to detach the fifth principle from the body of desire, and assimilate it to the fifth principle of the cosmos, to which he himself belongs. The fall into generation has preserved the equilibrium between the fourth and the eighth sphere, and the orderly cyclic path of man's intellectual evolution. It is the human law of gravity and corresponds to the centripetal force by which the planet holds its satellite in subjection. We may regard it in two aspects, as the cause of original sin and the effect of the divine love. Now, original sin, as I have said, is neither more nor less than the law of heredity. However much we may dislike it, the fact remains that man has an animal nature, with passions and instincts that link him on one side of his being with the brutes that perish. He is also conscious that he occupies an anomalous position in the universe, for while the gratifications of sense afford entire satisfaction to the brute creation, they can never refine them as he may constitute happiness for himself. At the same time, they are a hindrance to the development of his higher nature, so that, regarded simply from an intellectual point of view, they are an intolerable nuisance. The pursuit of knowledge is checked by continual temptations, more or less alluring, to forsake a path so beset with thorns and gather rosebuds while we may, and the distant view is bounded by the horizon of death. Until we know the meaning of life, the question will ever obtrude itself whether, after all, it be worth living. Now, all religions profess to solve this problem, and the religion of a nation or race is a fair index of its intellectual and spiritual development. Wherever a purely Aryan or a purely Semitic type prevails, both show a strong tendency to degenerate. An example of the former may be observed in India, where the intellectual element has degenerated into the grossest superstition and nature worship, and of the latter in Mohammedan countries, where the spiritual monotheistic element has become the crudest anthropomorphism. And in Christian countries, where either element has unduly prevailed and overlaid or corrupted the Catholic faith, there, on the one hand, flourish devotional pluralities, or on the other, a peculiarly repulsive form of Protestantism, which is the death of true spirituality. It is the nemesis of all false or defective systems of religion that they fail most signally in the very purpose for which they were instituted, that of elevating humanity. And the reason is that they are one and all based on the fundamentally unsound proposition that the body is, not the servant, but the enemy of the soul. This error has its source in ignorance of the fact that man was created not for himself, but for the glory of God, and we shall endeavour to trace it to its fountainhead. We have now arrived at a point from which we can view without prejudice the spiritual antagonism which is the origin of evil. It is a negative principle. Absolute evil is nothing. Absolute good is God or love. All that is more or less good compared with non-being, and more or less evil compared with God, and the spiritual activities of Lucifer are of the nature of a lower good in conflict with a higher. In order to understand it, we must take into consideration two very important facts. One, that the element of will, essential to the idea of conflict, which on the plane of human consciousness is of the nature of a cause, on the plane of spiritual consciousness is of the nature of an effect. In other words, where the one ends, the other begins. And two, we must remember that the fall of the angels was a fall from heavenly to earthly wisdom. It was spiritual death, and as death is always followed by birth, therefore was the rebirth of intelligence on the plane of human consciousness. All forms of material activity have their origin on the plane of spirit, and all forms of spiritual activity may be divided into synthetic or constructive, and analytic or destructive. Both have their place in the economy of the universe, and neither are in themselves good or evil, high or low. Now, the spiritual activities of Yahweh are synthetic or formative. His period, the period of Jehovah Michael, is the time connection between the father and mother principles in nature, and it culminated in the manifestation of the Word made flesh. He is the Lord of Sabbath, of the Dian-Chochanic hosts of light, who are on the descending arc of their cycle and proceed over what are called natural forces. Individually, will-less, they represent collectively the divine will, and the harmony of their diverse operations constitutes the divine providence. The captain of these hosts is Michael, Hebrew, like unto God, and he is represented in the book of Revelations as prevailing against the dragon, that ancient symbol of wisdom, and casting him out of heaven, not into a mythical hell, but into the earth, and his angels with him. Henceforward their place is found no more in heaven, and the angels of light became angels of darkness, groping in Maya, the great abyss or bottomless pit. The light that was in them became the property of man. It raised him from a mere automaton into a reasonable creature, capable of reciprocating the divine love and of intelligent cooperation with the divine purpose concerning him. Thus we see that the fall of the angels was overruled for man's benefit, and that, while it may be truly said to be the origin of evil, it was not in itself evil, but part of a grand scheme whereby man, by attaining to self-consciousness through experience, might become worthy of adoption and partaking of the divine nature, manifest in person, the omnipotence of love. Let us remember that evil is nothing but failure of adaptation to environment, and that the love of God is the environment of being on every plane of consciousness. We can only, as Hegel points out, conceive of being as becoming, and for this cause the whole creation groaneth and travaileth in pain, the pangs of imperfection, a necessary element in time manifestation, waiting for the adoption. The story of the fall in the book of Genesis is an allegorical presentation of a conflict which, originating on the plane of spirit and issuing through the gates of Maya, entered the plane of human consciousness and gave birth to the Mayavic opposition between the will of man and the will of God. The symbol of the conflict is the double vortex with its equilibrated centre between the fourth and the eighth spheres, and we can thus see that, while evil arises from the human will, the freedom which renders it possible can in no real sense be regarded as its cause. We are, therefore, in a better position to understand the nature of the conflict, whose issues regulate every department of human activity in the mass, and determine the course of human history, inasmuch as it secures for each individual that freedom of will which enables him to cooperate with the powers of either light or darkness, and, to a greater or less degree, hasten or retard the fulfilment of the divine purpose. In a very real sense, therefore, we may be said to wrestle with principalities and powers, and the rulers of the darkness of this world, and spiritual wickedness in the celestial region, for it is only through and by means of the human will that these can manifest on the plane of human consciousness. From these facts we may deduce the following conclusions. 1. That the fall of the angels was not caused by their rebellious will, but that the rebellious will of man had its origin in the imperfect control which the newborn intelligence exercised over his lower nature. And 2. That the spiritual conditions under which the higher and lower nature respectively developed were mutually antagonistic, the one deriving its vitality from the sympathetic or formative activity on the plane of spirit, and the other resulting from discriminatory or analytic spiritual activity. This being premised, we have now to consider the part played by the reason in bringing about the disorganization of human activity, which is the cause of evil in the world. It must not be forgotten that the intellectual faculty is essentially analytic, and that the power of synthesis belongs to the sixth principle. And here it is necessary to correct an error into which many Theosophists have fallen. They have taken it for granted that the power to reason resides wholly in the fifth principle, because it is the vehicle of the human as distinguished from the animal personality. The mistake has probably arisen from the very materialistic view of the seven principles set forth in esoteric Buddhism, in which each one is treated of separately as if it were an independent entity. Now, while it is true that the power to discriminate resides in the fifth principle, and is accordingly possessed, in a greater or less degree, by the brute creation, whose fourth principle or body of desire is thereby controlled, the power to reason, which involves syntheticization of disconnected concepts, has its origin in the embryotic sixth principle. As the lower animals would be mere automata, without the faculty of discrimination, so would man be wholly destitute of responsibility toward God and his fellow man, were he incapable of synthesizing to some degree his relations towards them. Now, the sixth principle of man corresponds to the sixth principle of the cosmos, or the divine wisdom, who for us men and for our salvation entered the great abyss of Maya, and in process of time manifested in the flesh and was born of a pure virgin. He was made manifest in order that he might destroy the works of the devil, or the Elohim of darkness, who are, collectively, the fifth cosmic principle, and whose efflorescence in time is Satan the adversary. Without entering into further details, we may take our stand on the broad principle that the divine love, which operates on every plane of human consciousness as the vivifier and sustainer, is opposed by the involutionary forces which originate in the spiritual activities of a being who was formerly a son of light, but who has been plunged into the abyss of Maya. Satan is therefore on the material plane the author of disease and physical death, of falsehood on the intellectual plane, and on the plane of spirit, selfishness or the negation of love. For all that, he is a minister of God, fulfilling the divine purpose by this very opposition, without which the omnipotence of love could not become manifest. To him, love is a consuming fire, and the divine wisdom a great horror of darkness. He and his legions are fighting for their lives and have entrenched themselves in the human personality as in a fortress from whence love, and love only, can drive them. We see, therefore, that it was love which drove man from paradise to the earth, and called into existence free will by attaching his fourth principle, or body of desire, to the earth by a bond sufficiently strong to balance the centrifugal impetus. Up to the time when he began to develop intelligence, the action of man's will had been purely automatic, the plane of its energies, so to speak, coinciding with the axis of the original vortex. But in the newly objectivized double vortex, the lower nature required to be consolidated in order to preserve it from absorption into the eighth sphere. Free will in man may therefore be defined as the point of equilibrium between his fifth or intellectual principle and his fourth or body of desire. Man thus became a responsible being with faculties capable of adapting themselves to the law of love which called him into existence. He is the seed of the divine love fructifying in the womb of Maya, the great abyss, or the illusion of the is not made pregnant by the divine love. This is the mystery of mysteries which no wisdom of the creature can ever fathom, but which was revealed, though as in a glass darkly, when the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. He took on himself a body that he might redeem our bodies by grafting them with his own, in order that the universe might become the perfect expression of the divine love. On the question of sacramentalism, I can touch but briefly. It is the assertion of the principle that matter is the vehicle of spirit, and its recognition is an intellectual necessity if we are to make any further progress towards comprehension of the natural order. The sacraments are 7 in number: baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, matrimony, penance, order, and extreme unction. They are the evolutionary equivalents of the sevenfold involutionary spiritual energy, which is the natural order calls the phenomena of birth, strength, nutrition, generation, recuperation, speech, and transmutation. Conversely, they stand to man's lower nature in the relation of death to sin, weakness to the flesh, absorption in the higher, self-surrender, mortification, obedience, and adaptation. The dynamic effects, therefore, if we may use the expression, of the Christian sacraments are involutionary as regards the lower and evolutionary in respect of the higher nature of man. If we apply this idea to the symbol of the double vortex, we shall recognize in the sacraments the appointed means whereby the opposing forces will ultimately range themselves around their true center, the personality, the fifth or human principle, and the attraction of the eighth sphere being neutralized. The spheroidal vortices will then coalesce and become one, first as an elliptical spheroid, and afterward as a true sphere capable of indefinite expansion. Sacramentalism is the assertion of a principle which has its analogy in nature in every case where a lower type of life is succeeded by a higher one. As F. D. Morris points out, it assumes Christ to be the Lord. It assumes that men are created in him, that this is the constitution of our race, that therefore all attempts of men to resolve themselves into separate units are contradictory and abortive. In bringing this course of lectures to an end, I may say that it has been my endeavour to supply materials whereby the true gnosis may be distinguished from the oppositions of science falsely so called. The agnosticism, which is the characteristic of modern thought, is an indication that the times are ripe for imparting truths which, 20 years ago, would have been as seed falling on the wayside. The remedy for evils which spring from ignorance is knowledge, but until the ignorance is confessed, the remedy cannot be applied. So long as men were satisfied with mechanical authority in religion, so long as it was considered scientific to call the unknown the unknowable, in other words, while men preferred darkness to light, nothing could be done. But we have lately witnessed a reaction from agnosticism and a revival of Gnosticism in one of its most dangerous forms. It is, therefore, of the highest importance that we should learn to distinguish the truths to which it bears witness from the falsehoods with which they have been artfully blended.